Hey, how's everybody doing today? This is Mark Brody, and we're here on the next episode of Coffee Talk with Brohawk. And today I am very fortunate to have as my guest today, Grace Judson. Grace, thank you very much. I know you are a leadership expert, a leadership trainer, and I would love for you to introduce yourself to the audience and tell us a little bit about yourself and what you're doing these days.
Well, I call myself a leadership geek. And yes, I proud self-proclaimed leadership geek here.
Hey, well,
I
you can
have been,
self-proclaim yourself that. It's
hey,
awesome.
sometimes we got to give ourselves our own titles, right?
Yes,
I
yes.
am a leadership consultant first and foremost, because I think that sometimes training is the answer and sometimes it's not the answer. And I want to make sure that we do the right thing for the specific situation that my clients are in. And to understand, there's so much I could say in terms of what I am up to, because it is so much about not just making sure that the senior leadership and the executive teams are aligned and on board and strategically focused, but also recognizing that that trickles down or should trickle down to, and what I say is that the first line manager is where the rubber of the corporate culture meets the road of the employee population. And they, especially now with so much remote and hybrid work, they are, I was listening to a podcast a few weeks ago where Satya Nadella, who is, of course, as I'm sure everybody on this knows, the CEO of Microsoft, and he was saying that the first line manager is the all-purpose concierge or all-service concierge for their teams in a way that they've never been before. And that is so true. And they need the support in order to be able to do that. So that's really where I mean, it's a broad range, but all of it is important when we talk about leadership and how important leadership is for every organization, obviously.
I work in we work in the contact center world here, and one of the components of a contact center is to have the right, basically, and I'm paraphrasing here, the right people in the right place at the right time that are fully supported.
Yes.
So I love hearing that, you know, you have a specific passion around making sure that those who are between the rock and the hard place, so to speak, are
Very much
fully
so.
supported.
Yeah.
I love that. So, as someone who works with many organizations, many leaders, throughout the country and all over, really, what
Mm-hmm.
are a couple of the toughest challenges that you're seeing leaders experience today, and how are these different, versus today versus what they were experiencing pre-pandemic?
Vastly different
Yes.
in a nutshell. Um, I think it goes back to what I was saying a few minutes ago, that the manager is stuck between a leadership that in some cases, and I think we're seeing that shift as there is more and more resistance from the teams. But the manager, like you were saying, it's a rock and a hard place, because on the one hand, their leadership is saying we got to get people back in the office. Now, we could have a whole nother coffee talk about whether that's the right thing to do or not. But
Yes.
nonetheless, the manager is now having to position this to their teams. Um, and their teams, and probably in many cases the manager as well, are not that happy about it. So I
Hmm.
think there's a number of things that need to be done intentionally and carefully and experimentally. Whereas, there is no going back. We ain't
Yeah.
going back to pre-pandemic. And this
Hmm.
is a real opportunity for leaders and their organizations to look at, how do we make this better, not just
Hmm.
different, but better. How do we use the office? I actually just wrote a post about this on LinkedIn because I came across it in a couple of places and I was like, oh, this is cool. How do we make the office a tool rather than a place to go to work?
Yes.
Because if we look at it as a tool, then, you don't, the rather far-fetched metaphor or analogy, I can never remember which is which, that I used in the LinkedIn post was you wouldn't use a hammer to make your coffee and you wouldn't pound a nail with your French press coffee maker. And that really is the kind of thing that I want people to look at. It's a big perspective shift.
Yes.
But if we look at the office as a tool and we give the managers and leaders that perspective and help them understand, okay, how do we bring people into the office in an intentional way that still gives them the flexibility and autonomy to do their work the way works for them, and not just keep trying to cram everybody back into the old ways of doing things. Leaders need to think about how to start measuring outcomes instead of time. I am horrified, and I do not use that word lightly, at some of the things I'm seeing about these, and the ways people are trying to get around it. The mouse jiggle tools, right? So that you look like you're active because your company is monitoring your computer. There's nothing more creativity killing and deep work massacring than that kind of thing. And these are just some of the things that leaders are challenged with right now. But if they don't take a step back and really think about how they want to lead, where are the gaps that have always been there or are now being introduced by the new ways that we're working. Yeah.
You used a word, as you were describing that that last section, intentional, and just my 2 cents here. I think a lot of leaders pre-pandemic, although there was some shift, right before everybody was sent home, where leaders were a little bit more passive and they were thinking technology was going to provide them everything they needed, and the agents would own their own desk and they'd know exactly what they were doing, right or wrong. But now, because of hybrid work or remote work, or even bringing people back into the office, I mean, there has to be a higher level of intentionalism when it comes to being a leader. You can't be as passive as what you may have been. What do you think about that?
Absolutely. And what I'll add to that is that there is, way back in the dawn of time when I was a young software engineer and business analyst, I encountered this in understanding business systems that I was then supposed to go and write the code for. And I still see it today in a consulting and training and development situation. And I think you've probably seen this too. There is a big temptation to throw a solution, often a technical solution, at something before you really know what that something is or what it's supposed to accomplish. The desire to jump to solution before you've defined the problem. And that's part of intentionality. And it's part of what I think that leaders have traditionally had a bias toward action. And that bias toward action can often cause people to skip the planning and analysis step that is so necessary, as you point out, to really, okay, what is this technology really going to do for us? Is it the right answer to a problem that have we actually defined it yet?
Yeah, and I talked to a lot of technology companies as well, and the first thing they say is, hey, our solution will do this or do that. We can cut cans and julienne fries, and I know I'm dating myself with that reference, but
right. No, it's the leap to the magic wand and the silver bullet. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And I tell them, look, I when I talk to people, I want to know the why they're looking at a certain solution.
Yep.
And just like you pointed out, I mean, you can bring in the next big shiny thing, but if it's not the right solution for what's actually going on the floor, and it's not supporting your supervisors or your teams anymore, it's the wrong solution.
Right. It could be the biggest, shiniest, most glorious tool in the world, but if it's not fit for purpose,
Yes.
But you got to know your purpose before you can make that decision. Yeah, absolutely.
Yes. Look inwardly before you can start looking outwardly,
Yeah.
for sure. So, how would you characterize what leadership is versus what leadership isn't? Um,
That is an interesting question.
mhm.
Leadership is, I think, one of the best definitions that I've heard. I believe, I hope I am not misquoting this, but I think a lot of people have said it, but I'm pretty sure Simon Sinek says it. Leadership is about creating more leaders. You want to grow your people. Rear Admiral Grace Hopper, who is one of my favorite people, no longer with us, but definitely one of my personal heroes, said, you don't manage people, you lead people, you manage things. And I think that's a very important distinction as well. Now, do leaders often have to manage? Yes, of course. Leadership at different levels of the organization can focus on different things. A long time ago, I did a sort of informal survey of a number of HR executives, executives in general, executive coaches. And I said, what is the one thing you wish that fledgling leaders, if you will, what is the one thing you wish that they knew more about and that they just don't seem to have an adequate grasp of? The answer was unanimous, and it was not what I expected. I expected communication skills. I got strategic thinking. So I think that the ability to think strategically and to understand what strategy even is, which even some senior leaders don't. There's a huge conflation of strategy and planning. And the term strategic planning should be banished because strategy is not planning. It leads to planning, but it ain't planning. And so, yeah, there's a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of growing a leadership pipeline within an organization and educating them on this question about what leadership is and what it isn't. Yeah. Have I answered your question?
Yeah, I mean, it confirms some things that I was thinking. I mean, I once interviewed for a position, a while back, and I was really focused on the leadership aspect of the role, and the folks that I was interviewing with were talking about like metrics and things that I that comprise a contact center, and they were still focused on the leadership piece as well. And I asked them a question. I said, if you're looking for a manager,
right,
you have the wrong person. If you're looking for a leader, then we definitely want to continue this conversation and see where it goes. And I ended up getting the job because
good for you on all counts.
I got a side note saying, yeah, we want a leader. Okay, all right, I got the job. But the thing is that to your point, I mean, manage when you use the analogy of strategic planning, you have to have the strategic vision to know what direction the ship wants to go. The planning is the tactical pieces of executing on the strategy.
Correct.
So not using strategic planning as a
it should not be a thing. It should not be a thing.
Yeah. I mean, that's awesome. No, but definitely I think that leadership, to your point, I mean, it's gotten away from the nuts and bolts and really is focused more on the people and the interactions.
Yes, and I was actually going to add that there is I'm torn on this because on the one hand, I've been talking about what I call professional empathy for a long time. And on the other hand, empathy has now become this buzzword that everybody when it's a buzzword, everybody rolls their eyes. Yes. But yes, the people aspect, especially now that we are emerging, I hope, from the pandemic. I don't want to,
No, not
tempt
knock on
fate
wood.
here. No, yeah, right. I don't want to tempt fate in that, but I do think we are. And the people aspect, I'm not a fan of dividing generations into behavioral patterns. I mean, there are certainly certain aspects of that work, but more to the point, I think pretty much everyone of all generations really got a wake up call. I mean, that's what the Great Resignation has been about.
Yes.
And the other thing, kind of relative to that, is, well, let me finish one thought before I start another. It was about people waking up and realizing that the way work was working wasn't working for them. And so the people element and the ways that people want to work and have autonomy over when and where and how they work and what, to some extent, what they do, clearly. I mean, anybody can pick up and leave a job. So the people aspect is huge now for leaders and managers. And I have seen several references to the sad reality that, as we were saying earlier, managers are stuck between a rock and a hard place. And so they are currently the highest proportion of people who are quitting, who are resigning. And they're not going to new management jobs. They are going to non-management roles. And companies need to think very seriously about this, because this is their leadership pipeline. And if there aren't people coming in willing to put in that very difficult work at that level, and they're not supporting the people who are putting that difficult work in at that level, they're going to have a problem doing succession planning and getting people into the higher levels. And it's just reality.
When you have salaries that have increased as much as they have over the last few years, and you can have someone in a frontline role with overtime making more than a supervisor. What's the
point?
What's the point? Why should we move up? And this is, I don't know if you can hear this behind me, but now I have some barking dogs.
Well, I think my dog was about to start dreaming, so I was about to say,
there you go.
But then she stopped. So
excellent. So just touching base on the evolution of what I would call the evolution of leadership. How have you seen leadership over the last 10, 15 years really evolve into where we are today versus versus back a few years?
It's become more human centered, people centered. Definitely. I mean, if we look at some of the leaders that, I won't name any names, but if we look at some of the leaders that were venerated 15 years ago and are now kind of given the side eye and like, well, maybe that wasn't such a great way to go. I think we have come a good way out of industrial era leadership. The pandemic is certainly giving that a significant boost, because when you're sending your office workers home now, clearly there are still a lot of people who have to be at work, but typically that is not in an office. It's in a restaurant, it's in a retail store, it's in a hotel, it's in a warehouse, it's in a different type of location.
Yes.
Leadership is definitely evolving, I would say, up until the pandemic, way too slowly out of the industrial era model, where it was command and control. And the industrial era emerged from military leadership.
Yep.
So you have military, you have industrial era, and then you have things sort of creeping into a knowledge era leadership. And now we are really looking much, much more into that. Certainly that's, what I jump up and down about, relative to not measuring time on the job, but measuring output. And I had an interesting conversation about that in a LinkedIn comment thread a few weeks ago, where somebody was saying, well, if I spend all day, it happened to be a software developer, if I spend all day trying to figure out what is wrong with this particular system or program that I'm working on, how is there any output there? And, I have to say I'm measuring time. I was like, no, you don't. Because ultimately the output is not what you did that day. The output is, did you meet your deadline with a quality product?
Yes.
And that's the mental shift that I hope we are moving toward in leadership as we go forward.
Yeah. And even in the contact center world, I mean, people are focused on resolution as opposed to average handle time, as an
I
example.
hope so, because when I call a contact center about something and it's like they're clearly trying to move me through their script, I'm like, wait, stop.
Yes.
Yeah. So I hope every now and then you get one that isn't. So, more power to you and your work and in getting that resolved.
Yeah, I know with a center that I led a few years back. We didn't even talk about AHT. We didn't talk about how long you were spending time. We actually saw when people were more focused on getting to the resolution faster, their efficiency got a lot better.
Yep. I was going to say, if you work on getting to the resolution rather than getting off the call, you are overall going to solve more problems faster.
Exactly, because then it's not just the frontline agent that's focused on resolution. It's the rest of the organization to make sure that frontline person has the tools and support that they need to get to that resolution faster.
Yep. Exactly.
And whether it's through technology, whether it's through smaller work groups, more focused call handling types or anything like that. I mean, whatever makes the most sense and it's not a one size fits all.
No. Oh God, no, never. I mean, I say that about leadership too. It's not one size fits all.
Yeah. Well, you were talking a little bit earlier in this conversation about the top things that people should look at as they're embarking on their leadership journey. And I think you were sharing that you had talked to some executives and they were talking about the strategic planning or strategy aspect of the job as opposed to the communication. But what would be, if you're going into an organization and they just ask you, hey, what are your top 3 recommendations for our folks that are looking to become leaders? What would you say to them?
Well, first I would say that, as you just said, it's not one size fits all. So I would want to look at what they're already doing. But in a more general context, I think there are a number of key skill sets. And anyone who wants to learn can. I am a violent opponent, maybe violent's a little too strong, vehement opponent to the idea that leaders are born, not made. They are not. I mean, yeah, sure, some people have a natural skill for it, but anybody can learn. Strategic thinking is a big piece. I think that in general, we don't teach critical thinking, which is a component of strategic thinking in schools. And that is one of the biggest problems that I see in organizations across the board, is that when somebody comes, a new employee comes in fairly junior, they don't even know in many cases what critical thinking is. Understanding communication, how to really let your team know who you are and who they are. Not from a standpoint of, so you then bend over backwards, but as we keep saying, it is not one size fits all. I have a good friend who's always saying we are all an experiment of one. And so learning the fundamental foundational skills of leadership is great, but you then have to be able to understand how you personally will apply those skills in your own individual way. Self-awareness is a huge thing. One of the things that I hear over and over and over again from new managers and new leaders is that it's lonely. So this is not exactly the question you were asking, but it is very much a component of how do you learn. People learn in community. So finding other people who are on the same journey as you are, whether within your organization, if it's a big enough organization, if it's smaller, look outside to find communities where you can share, war stories, if you will, get feedback from people, even if it's not somebody who's in a senior leadership position.
I love the that last one that you just mentioned, the whole idea of networking. That's how you and I got together.
Right.
That's how you and I met each other. And there's a lot of good regional associations from a contact center standpoint, from a HR standpoint. I mean, SHRM has a great network. If you're a product owner or a product manager, there's communities out there, and the networking aspect cannot be overstated enough.
Absolutely. And what I would say to any of those, I mean, there's the Association for Talent Development for Learning and Development People. There's PM, Project Management Institute is all over the place. I've spoken at a number of their chapters. So if you are in a specific field and want to find a professional organization, just Google it. And what I will say is, don't just go to the meetings, the chapter meetings. Volunteer. Because that's how you actually meet people that you will then, I used to live in San Diego, and I was part of the Association for Talent Development chapter there, which was one of the largest in the country at the time. I was on the board, I volunteered, and I still am in touch with people from there. I've gotten calls for, to do projects for people that I'm still in touch with from there. Networking is a tough subject for many people. But even if it's just, it's hard, especially now that there's still relatively little in-person stuff. But LinkedIn, if you really work it, that's how we met.
Exactly. And I got to give props to ATD. Even though I'm not in talent and development, that's not my, I'm not a trainer by trade. But I've gone to a couple of their big events, back a few years ago, and just the critical thinking that goes on to be an effective trainer as a leader. It was very eye-opening. So it's okay to cross industries.
Absolutely. If you're looking for other managers to hang out with and shop talk with from a manager and leader perspective, definitely cross-pollinate, because you never know who's going to have an interesting idea and a different perspective. There is so much to be gained from stepping outside of your little knowledge bubble. I'm not going to use the term, comfort zone, but just your knowledge bubble of people who are all involved in the same kinds of thing. Get outside that and you will learn a ton. Plus, there are endless numbers of books, podcasts, such as what we're doing here, ways that you can pick up ideas from very senior people. About, Fortune magazine has some podcasts where they talk to really senior leaders. So you can learn a lot just by doing your own research and due diligence along those lines.
I love that. I love that. Well, Grace, we've gotten to the point of this this episode of Coffee Talk with Brohawk, where I call it the speed round. Are you ready for this?
I'm ready. So I suppose that means I need to contain my verbosity and give quick answers.
No. Be as verbose as you prefer, as you want to be. So what fact about Grace would people be surprised to learn about you?
This is fun. If you happen to have read my About page, you wouldn't be surprised. But since most people here probably haven't, I will give you two. One is that back in, I'm going to look at the thing on my wall and I can't quite read it. 2002. That was it. I was America's fastest knitter, and I competed for the
Really?
world title and lost by, I think it was 3 stitches in 2 minutes.
Oh my
Yeah.
gosh.
The other little factoid that I will give you is that at one point I am a cat person. At one point I was actually a crazy cat lady with 10 cats. It was not
You know,
intentional.
but because you had so many cats, you had enough sweaters, and if you didn't have a sweater for them, they would you could knit one pretty quick.
There you go.
Excellent. Excellent. So what is your ideal off the grid location?
uh, I don't go off the grid often enough. I'll tell you, when I lived in San Diego, I used to go up to Palomar Mountain. I used to call it my um, retreat office. I would take a big stack of notebooks and colored pens and whatnot and just go up there and spend the day hiking and doing some, actual on paper, which I very seldom use paper, but actual on paper thinking. Another place I used to go is the Eastern Sierras. I would go up to Rock Creek and go camping up there. Beautiful, beautiful area.
Very nice. So you mentioned this thing called paper. What is
I
that?
know, right?
I've heard about it. I've read about it.
I use very little at this point. I try to use as
Exactly.
little as possible.
I love it. I love it. So what product jingle gets stuck in your brain every time you hear it?
Well, I'm actually going to say none because I watch very little television and don't listen to the ads because we watch it all either recorded and so we skip the ads or streaming things that don't have ads. And when I'm listening to
Yes.
podcasts and whatnot, I freely admit I fast forward through the ads.
Very nice. Very nice. And I think that's more common than advertisers would like to think.
Right. I believe you. Yeah. Well, we also have
Um,
a YouTube subscription, so I don't get any of the
yeah,
ads on YouTube either.
excellent, excellent. Um, so if someone wants to pick your brain on leadership, or any of the other things that we may have talked about in today's episode, how could they go ahead and contact you?
Certainly through my website, and I will say that there are a lot of resources available on my website for people who want to get their feet wet in leadership and understand, maybe even senior leaders who want to figure out how to do a better job of developing their leaders. So my website is just my name, gracejudson.com. On my resources page, speaking of cats, there's a cute cat picture. And otherwise, I am very active, as we've already said, on LinkedIn. So find me on LinkedIn, hit me up, message me if you want to talk. I'm always open for a conversation. I live a rather isolated life here behind my computer, so I'm always happy to schedule time to talk to people and find out what's going on for them and see what kind of resources I can offer to help.
Grace, I really appreciate you being a resource for our audience here.
My
Um, you
pleasure.
know, I really appreciate you taking time out of your schedule to agree to be a guest on Coffee Talk with Brohawk.
Well, I
And
appreciate the invitation. This is fun.
this is a lot of fun, and I learn a little bit of something out of every guest that I have on here,
I
and
believe
today
it.
was no exception. So,
Well, thank you.
well, thank you very much for tuning in. And if you like this episode, there's other episodes out there on the Brohawk Solutions YouTube channel, and look forward to seeing you tuned in to other episodes in the future. And Grace, I know this is not going to be our last conversation.
I hope not. Yes. Cool. Thank
Excellent.
you.
Well, thank you very much, and have a great day.